Everyone having a right to a safe and stable home benefits us all. I come with no other agenda than desperately.
He flew across the Atlantic believing there was still a chance. He left with nothing but a car ride and a closed door. What happened inside that meeting will haunt the House of Windsor for years. The last request. Nobody was supposed to know about the call. That is the first thing you need to understand about what happened in the weeks leading up to early April 2025. There were no press releases, no statements from Kensington Palace, no carefully worded confirmation from Harry's team in Montecito, just a quiet back-channel communication that moved through intermediaries the way sensitive royal business always does. Carefully, slowly, with maximum deniability on both sides. Harry had made a decision. He was going to try one more time. Those close to him say it had been building for months. The weight of the distance, the silence that had calcified between the two brothers into something that no longer felt temporary. Harry had spent the better part of 2 years telling himself and telling Meghan and telling the small circle of people he still trusted that he was fine with how things stood, that he had made his peace with it, that California was home now and the past was the past. But something shifted in the early weeks of 2025. Sources familiar with Harry's state of mind during that period describe a man who was quietly, privately unraveling, not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that would ever reach the tabloids, but in the way that grief moves when it has nowhere to go. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about his children growing up without cousins they knew. He was thinking about the version of his life that existed before everything fell apart, and he was having trouble letting it go. So he made the call, not directly. That is not how this family operates. A mutual contact, someone with credibility on both sides of the divide, was asked to carry a message to William's circle. The message was simple. Harry wanted to talk, not through lawyers, not through palace officials with agendas of their own, just the two of them. Brothers. In a room without an audience. Now, here is where it gets complicated, because the request itself was not the surprising part. Harry had reached out before, through various channels, with various degrees of formality. What was different this time was the specific nature of what he was asking for. According to sources with direct knowledge of the communication, Harry was not simply asking for a conversation about the family relationship. He was asking for something more structured, more consequential. He wanted to discuss the future, the future of his children standing within the royal framework, and he wanted William to be the one to facilitate it. That detail matters enormously, because it tells you something about where Harry's head was. He was not approaching this as a younger brother, simply missing his older brother. He was approaching it as a man who had done the maths, who had looked at the landscape of his life in America, the deals that were slowing down, the public goodwill that was thinner than it had been 2 years before, the Netflix projects, the Spotify fallout, the memoir aftermath, and had concluded that some form of rehabilitation within the royal world was not just emotionally desirable, but practically necessary. He needed William, and the painful truth is that Harry knew it. People in Harry's circle were not unanimous about this approach. At least 2 individuals close to him reportedly urged caution. One source described a conversation in which Harry was told directly that reaching out on these terms, with these specific asks, was giving William enormous leverage, that it repositioned Harry not as a reconciling brother, but as a supplicant, someone coming back not from strength, but from need. Harry heard those concerns, and he made the call anyway. That tells you something about the desperation underneath the surface. Because Harry is not a man who ignores advice carelessly. He processes it, he weighs it. And when he proceeds in spite of it, it is because the emotional pull is stronger than the strategic calculation. He wanted to believe that William would respond differently this time, that enough time had passed, that the anger had cooled, that the brother he grew up with, the one who used to share a dormitory at Eton and ride horses across Balmoral in the summer, was still somewhere underneath the institution that William had become. The message was delivered in the second week of March 2025. For 12 days, there was silence. Not a refusal, not a confirmation, just silence. And anyone who has ever dealt with the British royal machine at close range will tell you that silence is not neutral. Silence is a communication of its own. It means the message was received, assessed, discussed behind closed doors, and that a decision was being made about how to respond and on what terms. Harry waited. Those around him described those 12 days as some of the most tense of the entire California period. He was checking in with the intermediary regularly. He was trying to read signals that were not there. He was constructing narratives in his head about what the delay meant, oscillating between hope and dread in a cycle that people close to him found exhausting to witness. Then, on the 24th of March, 2025, the response came back. William would meet him, but not on Harry's terms, on William's, and the conditions attached to that agreement, conditions that Harry would not fully understand until much later, were the first sign that this meeting was never going to go the way he had hoped. William had not said yes out of brotherly warmth. He had said yes because he had something he wanted to say, and he had decided that a face-to-face meeting was the cleanest way to say it. Harry booked his flight that same evening. He told Meghan it was a good sign. It was not a good sign. The terms William set. While solid. Before Harry's plane left California, William had already made up his mind. That is the part that makes this story so difficult to sit with. Because while Harry was packing his bags and telling himself that things might finally be turning around, the decision had already been made on the other side of the Atlantic. William had not agreed to the meeting because he was open to negotiation. He had agreed to the meeting because he wanted to close a door, permanently, and he wanted Harry to hear it from him directly. Sources close to Kensington Palace describe a series of conversations that took place in the last week of March 2025. Private conversations. The kind that do not get minuted or filed. William, speaking with a very small group of senior aides, people who have been with him long enough to know the difference between the prince processing something and the prince who has already decided. This was the second kind William had decided. And the terms he set before the meeting even happened tell you everything about the posture he had chosen. This was not a man preparing to reconcile. This was a man preparing to conclude. There is a difference, and the people around William at that time understood it clearly even if Harry did not. The first term was location. William chose where the meeting would take place, and the choice was deliberate. It would not be at Windsor. It would not be at Sandringham. It would not be at any location that carried the emotional weight of shared memory or family history. It would be somewhere controlled, neutral in the way that royal settings are never truly neutral, functional rather than symbolic. A place that said business, not brotherhood. That choice alone was a signal. The second term was time. William capped the meeting. Sources indicate he had communicated through the intermediary that the conversation would have a defined endpoint. Not an open-ended afternoon. Not the kind of long, difficult, unstructured conversation that real reconciliation would have required. A window, contained, manageable. The kind of time allocation you give to a meeting you have already decided the outcome of. Harry was told about the time limitation before he landed. He told himself it was a logistical consideration. It was not a logistical consideration. The third term was the most significant. And this is the one that sources say Harry did not fully absorb until he was already in the room. William had made clear to his inner circle that he was not coming to the meeting to discuss possibilities. He was coming to communicate a position, a final position, one that had been arrived at carefully, discussed with advisors, and was not open to revision based on anything Harry might say or bring to the table. Now, here is what makes that so striking. William is not an impulsive man. The people who work closely with him describe someone who takes a long time to arrive at decisions, but who, once arrived, does not move. He is not like his father in that way. Charles, for all his complexity, always left a window open, always held some emotional door ajar, even when the relationship was at its most strained. William does not operate that way. When William closes something, the people around him say, it stays closed. And he had been closing this particular door for a long time. The anger from the memoir alone had taken something from William that never came back. Sources in his circle described the publication of Spare in January 2023 as a turning point that people on the outside consistently underestimated. It was not just the specific revelations, it was the fact of it, the deliberate public authored dismantling of private moments. William could not forgive that, not fully, not in the way Harry needed him to. But there was something else underneath the anger, something older and more structural. People who have observed the Wales brothers closely over many years describe a dynamic that predates the Meghan years, predates the Oprah interview, predates all of it. A dynamic rooted in birth order, in institutional expectation, in the fundamentally different lives that the crown assigns to the heir and the spare, before either of them is old enough to understand what those words mean. William was always going to be king. Harry was always going to be everything else. And for most of their childhood and young adulthood, they found a way to make that work. Harry brought levity. William brought duty. Harry was the one the press found charming and unthreatening, precisely because he posed no challenge to the succession. There was an unspoken arrangement in that dynamic, and it functioned as long as both brothers understood and accepted their respective positions within it. What Harry did, in William's view, was break that arrangement. Not just by leaving, not just by moving to California or stepping back from royal duties, but by then turning around and using the access, the memories, the private interior of their shared life as material, as content, as a product to be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. In William's framework, that was not just a personal betrayal, it was a structural one. It violated something that William considers almost sacred about the institution he is being prepared to lead. That is the emotional foundation on which William's terms were built, and understanding that foundation is the only way to understand why the terms were so absolute. There was no list of demands Harry could meet. There was no apology worded carefully enough. There was no gesture grand enough to reopen what William had decided to close. The terms were not a negotiation framework. They were the shape of a conclusion that had already been reached. Harry's team did not know this. Or perhaps more accurately, they knew it intellectually, but did not believe it emotionally. One source with knowledge of Harry's preparation for the trip described conversations in which Harry's people were gaming out scenarios. What if William asks for a public statement? What if he wants a commitment about future media projects? What if he raises the question of the children's titles? They were preparing for negotiation. They were bringing arguments, contingencies, emotional appeals carefully constructed to move a man who had already decided not to be moved. It would have been almost strategic had the ground beneath it not been so completely hollow. There is one more detail from this period that needs to be documented. In the days before Harry flew to London, a source very close to William reportedly made contact with a journalist at one of the major British newspapers, not to plant a story, not to brief against Harry, simply to establish a certain awareness, to let it be known in the way that palace circles communicate when they want something understood but not printed, that whatever came out of the upcoming meeting, William's position was settled and should not be interpreted as the beginning of a process. It was the end of one. Harry landed at Heathrow on the 3rd of April, 2025. He had not slept well on the flight. He was carrying hope he had no business carrying. And somewhere across the city, in a room Harry had not yet entered, everything he was about to ask for had already been answered. The room where it ended. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. That detail, 1 hour and 40 minutes, is the first thing sources mention when they describe what happened on the 4th of April, 2025. Not what was said, not how it ended. The duration. Because the duration tells its own story. 1 hour and 40 minutes is too long for a dismissal, and too short for a reconciliation. It is exactly the length of a conversation where one person has come to deliver a verdict and the other person has refused, at first, to accept it. Harry arrived at the location shortly after 11 in the morning. He came without an entourage. That was deliberate on his part. A choice sources say he made specifically to signal good faith. No lawyers, no communications advisors, no buffer between himself and his brother, just Harry. The way it used to be when they were young, and the world outside did not yet have a name for what they were to each other. William was already there when Harry arrived. That detail matters too. In the choreography of royal encounters, who arrives first carries weight. William being there ahead of Harry was not accidental. It was a positioning. It said, "This is my territory, my timetable, my meeting." Harry walked into a room that William had already claimed. And however subtle that dynamic might seem to an outside observer, to two men raised inside the rituals of this institution, it communicated volumes before a single word was spoken. People with knowledge of the early minutes of the meeting describe an atmosphere of extraordinary tension dressed up as civility. There was no embrace. Sources are consistent on that point. There was no physical greeting of the kind that brothers who have not seen each other for months might naturally exchange. There was a nod, an acknowledgement, the kind of restrained formality that in any other family would signal estrangement, but that inside the Windsor world can sometimes pass for normal. Harry reportedly attempted to break the atmosphere with something light in the first moments, a small comment, an attempt at the easy warmth that used to come naturally between them. William did not take the opening. He moved almost immediately to the substance of why they were there. And this is where the accounts of what happened become harder to piece together, because the people with direct knowledge of the conversation are protecting it carefully. What has emerged comes from individuals on the periphery, people who spoke to Harry afterward, people in William's circle who were briefed on the outcome. The picture is incomplete, but the outline is clear enough to document. William spoke first and he spoke at length. He told Harry that he had given the situation a great deal of thought, more thought than Harry probably realized. He said that the events of the past several years had made certain things impossible, not difficult, not complicated, impossible, and that he felt it was important that Harry heard that word clearly and understood that it was chosen deliberately. Harry, according to sources, listened without interrupting, which is itself a significant detail, because Harry is not a man who typically absorbs difficult information quietly. He processes out loud, he pushes back, he asks questions. The fact that he sat in silence through William's opening tells you something about the weight of what he was hearing. It tells you that on some level, some deeply buried level that he had been refusing to excavate, he already knew what was coming. William told him that the question of titles for Archie and Lilibet was settled. It was not something he was willing to revisit or advocate for on Harry's behalf. The children standing within the formal royal framework was what it was, and William was not going to use his influence or his future position to alter it. He was direct about this, almost clinical. Sources describe it as the moment the temperature in the room dropped. Harry responded to this. He spoke about the children specifically, about what it meant for them to grow up without the connection to their heritage that titles would represent. About Lilibet, who is named for a woman both brothers loved and lost. About Archie, who is old enough now to ask questions that Harry finds increasingly difficult to answer. He made the case not as a royal argument, but as a father's argument. William heard it, and then he continued. He moved to the question of Harry's potential return to any form of public royal function, even a limited one, even a ceremonial one. The kind of partial re-engagement that Harry's team had apparently floated through the intermediary as a possible middle ground. William closed that door too. He said, and sources are remarkably consistent on the specific substance of this, that any form of official re-engagement would require conditions that Harry had demonstrated, through his own actions and his own words, he was unwilling or unable to meet. He did not list the conditions. He did not need to. Both men in that room understood what they were: the memoir, the interviews, the ongoing media presence, the fundamental incompatibility between the life Harry had chosen and the silence that the institution requires. William was not punishing Harry for specific transgressions. He was describing a reality, and the reality was that Harry had built a public identity in direct opposition to everything the Crown stands for, and those two things could not coexist within any formal arrangement. It was around this point in the conversation, sources say, that Harry's composure began to fracture, not dramatically, not in a way that became a scene, but those who know Harry well and who spoke to him in the hours after the meeting describe something breaking in him during this portion of the conversation. His eyes, the way his voice changed, the particular quality of silence that falls over a person when they realize that the thing they came to fight for is already gone. He had not fully believed it until that moment. He asked William directly whether there was anything, any path, any version of events in which the relationship between them could find some functional form, not a return to what they were. He was not asking for that. He was asking for something, anything, a thread. William's answer was careful. He did not say never. He is too measured a man to use absolute language in a setting like that. But what he said carried the weight of never. He spoke about trust, about what trust requires and what destroys it. He spoke about the institution and his responsibility to it, He spoke about Catherine and his children and what he owed them in terms of stability and protection from further disruption. And then he said something that sources describe as the most devastating line of the entire conversation. He said that he hoped Harry would find what he was looking for, past tense in its emotional register, closing in its structure, the kind of thing you say to someone you have already let go of. Not cruel, not cold in its delivery, but final in a way that no amount of follow-up conversation could reverse. Harry sat with that for a long moment, then he asked about their father. Sources diverged slightly on what was exchanged about Charles. What is consistent across accounts is that this portion of the conversation was brief, and that William drew a clear line around it. His father's situation, his father's choices about his own relationship with Harry, were separate from this conversation. William was not speaking for Charles. He was speaking for himself. That separation, deliberate and firm, was its own message. Harry had been hoping, on some level, that concern for Charles's health and the fragility of the time they had left with him might be a point of shared vulnerability, a place where the brothers could find common emotional ground, regardless of everything else. William did not allow that ground to open. The meeting ended at 12:47 in the afternoon. They did not embrace when Harry left. Harry walked out to a waiting car. He did not speak to the driver. Sources who saw him shortly after describe a man who looked not angry, but hollowed out, like something had been removed from him that he had been carrying for a long time without realizing how much weight it had. He stared out of the window on the drive back, and he did not make any of the calls that his team had been expecting him to make with an update. He sat in silence for a very long time. And in that silence, somewhere between the location of the meeting and wherever the car was taking him next, the full reality of what had just happened began to settle. William had not come to negotiate. He had come to finish something. And he had finished it. What Harry lost. There is a version of this story that focuses on the emotion, on the tears, on the hollowed-out man in the back of a car, staring at a city that used to be home. That version is true, and it deserves to be told. But there is another version running underneath it, colder, more structural, more devastating in a different way. Because what William's decision did was not just wound Harry emotionally, it closed off things, concrete things, tangible things. Things Harry had been quietly counting on as a safety net beneath the life he had built in California. When you lay those things out one by one, the full weight of what was lost becomes something much larger than a broken brotherhood. Or it becomes the story of a man who bet everything on a door staying open, and lost. The first thing Harry lost was the titles. When King Charles ascended to the throne in September 2022, Harry's children became eligible for the titles of Prince and Princess. Eligible. But eligibility is not conferral. The active granting of those titles required advocacy from within the family. Harry had been hoping William would be that quiet advocate, not publicly. Just a word in the right place. The kind of thing that moves silently inside this institution when someone with power decides to make it happen. William made clear in that room that no such word would be coming. Sources close to Harry describe this as the loss that landed first. Not because titles are vanity, but because of what they mean to the children. Archie is at the age where identity begins to matter, where a child starts to understand who his family is and what his place within it means. Harry had hoped his son would not grow up feeling like an afterthought to an institution that carries his bloodline. That hope is now gone. The second thing Harry lost was access. Not physical access. Harry can still attend public events. What he lost is the informal channel, the quiet route through which senior royals navigate things that cannot become formal requests. That channel ran through William. Even during the worst years of their estrangement, there had been a residual connection. A sense that if something urgent arose, a message could get through. William's decision sealed that channel. What replaced it is the full weight of formal process. Official correspondence. Communications filtered through palace officials whose job is to manage, slow, and sanitize. Harry knows this system, and he knows that being managed is not the same as being family. The third thing Harry lost was financial stability. This is the part least discussed publicly, but one of the most significant practical consequences. Harry's financial situation in California is shakier than it appears. the Netflix deal has not performed at the level that guarantees renewal on the same terms. The Spotify arrangement collapsed in 2023. The memoir generated income, but also backlash. And backlash has a commercial cost. Harry had been counting, perhaps without fully admitting it to himself, on some form of reintegration with the royal brand as a long-term commercial stabilizer. Not a salary, not a return to public duties, but the implied credibility that comes with being connected, even loosely, to the most famous family in the world. That credibility has a market value. William's decision removed it. Harry is no longer a royal in exile with a possible future inside the institution. He is simply a man who used to be a prince, and that is a fundamentally different product. The fourth and most personal thing Harry lost was the version of the future he had been quietly carrying. Not a dramatic reunion, not a public reconciliation with cameras and carefully worded statements. Just a quiet version, the one where Archie and George know each other the way cousins should, where Lilibet and Charlotte sit in the same room and understand instinctively that they are family, where two old men who were once brothers find their way back to something. Not everything, just something. That version requires a foundation laid now. William's decision means that foundation will not be laid. Sources who spoke to Harry in the hours after the meeting describe a man cycling through the losses out loud, naming them one by one to the people around him. The titles, the access, the future. Going through them the way a person inventories damage after something has collapsed. At one point, Harry said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said he thought William would blink. He had gone in believing that, face to face, with no institution between them, the brother underneath the air would surface. That something human would break through. William did not blink. He did not move a single inch, and Harry was left standing in the wreckage of a plan that had never once accounted for complete and total refusal. The fallout and what comes next. Harry flew back to California on the 6th of April, 2025. He did not issue a statement, neither did William. The palace said nothing, and that silence, coordinated and total, was in its own way the loudest thing either side could have done. Because silence after a meeting like that does not mean nothing happened. It means both parties understood the magnitude of what happened, and neither was ready to face the public version of it. Meghan was waiting when he landed. Sources close to the couple described the reunion as quiet, not tense, not a confrontation. Just quiet in the way that two people are quiet when one of them has returned from something the other one always feared would end this way. Meghan had been cautiously supportive of the trip. She had not opposed it. But people familiar with her thinking describe a woman who had never fully believed the meeting would produce anything different from every previous attempt. She was not surprised. That, sources say, made it harder for Harry in a specific way. There is something isolating about returning from a defeat to someone who saw it coming, even when that person is kind about it, even when there is no reproach. The absence of surprise carries its own weight. Harry spent the first several days back in Montecito largely withdrawn. He canceled scheduled calls. He was minimally present in work conversations that his team had been expecting him to drive. The people around him gave him space and watched him carefully and said very little. The question everyone in his circle was quietly asking was the same question this documentary has been building toward. What does Harry do now? Because the old strategy is finished. The positioning of himself as a man with one foot still pointed toward home, toward reconciliation, toward some eventual restoration of family, that positioning no longer holds. William's decision made it impossible to sustain, and without it, Harry has to construct something new, an identity, a direction, a reason for the next chapter that does not depend on a door that has now been permanently closed. Some in his circle believe this moment, as painful as it is, forces a clarity that has been missing, that Harry can now stop waiting and start building something that does not require his brother's approval or his family's rehabilitation to have value, that the release from hope, brutal as it feels, is also a release from limbo. Others are less certain, because Harry, without the royal thread, without the tension and the hope and the unresolved family drama that has animated his public story for 5 years, is a different proposition. And nobody yet knows whether the audience that has followed that story will follow him into whatever comes next. What the record of this family suggests, across generations of fracture and silence and irreconcilable distance, is that these wounds do not tend to heal on anyone's preferred timeline. they calcify. They become the thing the next generation inherits without fully understanding where it came from. Archie and George, Lilibet and Charlotte. Children who did not choose any of this, and who will grow up inside the consequences of decisions made before they were old enough to understand them. That is the oldest Windsor story of all, and it is still being written. William made his decision, and he did not look back. Harry came hoping for a thread and left with nothing in his hands. The crown always wins. The institution always outlasts the individual. And somewhere in California, a man who was born into one of the most powerful families on Earth is quietly learning what it means to be truly on his own.